There is a tremendous amount of discussion on YouTube and elsewhere about the concept of the shadow. The term was invented by Carl Jung, but has been described symbolically in mythology and literature since time immemorial. The shadow is the unconscious component of the personality, also described as the opposite side of the ego. It is so often ignored by modern man, to his detriment. The unconscious holds many unrealized aspects of the personality, both good and bad, repressed by our misguided ego consciousness. It's within these repressed aspects that lies the key to the crucial process of self-individuation. But why is any of this important? The shadow, along with accompanying aspects of ego, anima, and animus, are essential for the singular goal of achieving your destiny. There's a lot of fancy psychology words, explanations, and metaphors I could use for this, but it's just that simple. It's your destiny to undergo personal development. Only in doing so can you hope to achieve your true dreams and aspirations. It is this achievement that will make you more happy and content. And the achievement is not necessarily material riches. We're all trying to discover the meaning of life, and it is on this path that it lies. Throughout this journey, I strongly recommend a spiritual guide. This guide is essential and serves as a moral compass to defend against impulses, inclinations, or interpretations of unconscious imagery which may lead one astray. For me, this guided Jesus. For Jung, it took the form of a wise old man. The spiritual guide can also help reveal inner truths and provide consolation in times of disappointment and despair, which is pretty important. Having listened to Jordan Peterson's explanations and various other videos on YouTube, I am intrigued, but not satisfied. So I'm going to attempt to explain the shadow independently by going back to the original literature, which is somewhat sparse and fragmented. Starting with Man and His Symbols, Part 3, The Process of Individuation, by M.L. von Franz. Franz starts off by describing the isolated Naskapi Indians of the Labrador Peninsula of Canada. They have a very personal religion. Instead of an advanced pantheon of gods or elaborate rituals, the Naskapi believe in an inner deity that inhabits their soul. This entity is named Mr. Pio, also known as the Great Man. The Naskapi pay great attention to their dreams. They believe the dreams serve as an essential guide and instruction to personal development. The Naskapi who pay attention to their dreams and attempt to derive meaning and guidance from them enter into a deeper connection with the Great Man. They believe the Great Man favors such dream readers, sending them more and better dreams. Jung held the Naskapi in great esteem because he believed this practice to be a form of self-development uncontaminated by modern civilization. The self is best defined as an inner regulating center, which when correctly interpreted brings about constant development and maturity of personality. The self is separate to conscious personality and ego. It can only be understood using messages from the unconscious, that of dreams. The personality, being both a product of the unconscious ego and unconscious self, can develop only so far as the ego is willing to listen to the messages of the unconscious self. Similar to the Naskapi, the person more perceptive to the messages contained within dreams will achieve greater benefit than those who neglect their dreams. The most common barrier to this development is that of the conscious ego, which for reasons of embarrassment, neglect, or other, is unable to listen to the inner urge towards growth. What does this personal development and maturity achieve? Your destiny. It achieves your destiny. To fulfill one's destiny and achieve true contentment is the greatest human achievement at all. The basic, utilitarian requirements of ordinary life will hardly satisfy one for meaning in the final years. But I do have to warn you, this path is not simple. It requires great wisdom, bravery, and perception, the ability to distinguish material desires of the flesh from those of the soul. As I said earlier, a spiritual guide is essential. The ego, as we all know, has a tendency to get out of control. The power which we give to our dreams and to our ego can all too easily corrupt. It's a common criticism of Jungian psychology that it is not systematic. And this is correct. As I stated earlier, it requires great introspective ability, perception, and wisdom. Sometimes even the best of us lack this, and we must resort to inner conversation with our spiritual guide, through meditation or prayer or something similar. The journey itself is bespoke, specific to each and every individual that embarks. I want to quickly reference the legend of the Holy Grail. To begin the Grail journey, each knight must enter the woods at the point that appears darkest to him. A simple yet cryptic instruction. So let's start with the childhood. Childhood is a period of great emotional intensity. To the child, everything is new and novel. Both good and bad experiences are greatly amplified. From the first sip of Coca-Cola to the first experience of rejection and conflict in the school playground, it's as though the volume on life has been cranked up to 100. The school age is important. as this is the phase of ego building and adaptation to others begins. This period, whether remembered fondly or exiled to the recesses of memory, will contain a series of painful psychological shocks. Children blessed with a stable family life and sociability will experience less of these shocks. Others, coming from more turbulent homes or exhibiting uncommon tendencies, may become more aware of a personal uniqueness and a corresponding loneliness. In this early phase, there are children who seek for a meaning in life that will help them contend with the chaos both within and outside themselves. There are also other children carried along unconsciously by inherited and instinctual behaviors that are unconcerned about the deeper meaning of life. These children often experience a natural satisfaction of meaning in their experiences of love, nature, sport, and work, which precludes any further requirements for meaning. The process for self-individuation, the conscious ego coming to terms with unconscious self, generally begins with a wounding of personality and experience of suffering that comes with it. For the introspective, this wounding constitutes a call. In most people, it's common for the ego to feel frustrated by some obstruction, and this obstruction can be projected as frustration onto something external, be it God, the economy, maybe even the marriage partner, as being instrumental in this obstruction. Alternatively, a person may seem and think his life is going fine, but may suffer from a deep and unknown feeling of listlessness, a deadly boredom that makes activities seem meaningless and empty. Long before the complex analytics of Jung, myth and legend were describing this first stage of the process of individuation. Some of these scenarios may seem familiar. These would include a king that has fallen ill or grown old, a royal couple is barren, a monster steals all women, children, horses, and wealth of the kingdom. A monster, maybe a dragon, keeps and prevents the king's army or navy from proceeding on their path. Or maybe darkness hangs over the lands, wells dry up, flood, drought, and frost ruin the country. When talking about these fairy tales, these myths, these legends, we should probably start with the first, and that would be the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian legend some 4,000 years old, which tells of a tyrannical king who fights a beast which later becomes his friend and leads him on epic adventures. The Epic of Gilgamesh is quite interesting because the king, Gilgamesh, is quite tyrannical, and he does some bad things to the women and men of his kingdom. So the people of his kingdom pray to the gods and ask them to do something about it. So the gods send down this man-monster thing called Enkidu. When Gilgamesh hears about Enkidu, he seeks him out and fights him in some way, and defeats him, and befriends him. And this friend then takes Enkidu on a number of heroic and incredible adventures that constitute the majority of the tale of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it seems to be that Enkidu is some kind of embodiment of the shadow of Gilgamesh. And only by incorporating this element of the shadow of Gilgamesh does he find the calling that gets him out of his mischief, his tyrannical ways, and allows him to find fulfillment in his life beyond just being a beastly ruler over the people of his kingdom. That's a very interesting story, and I will be discussing it in further depth in a later video. The misfortunes listed above are often cured by a way of unusual or unique omen, magic or talisman. Examples such as a white blackbird, a fish that carries a golden ring in its gills, may come to mind. In others, the king or hero seeks the water of life, a magical chalice, 3 hairs from the head of the devil, or a fine damsel's golden plate. Whatever the talisman may be, it's often unique and difficult to find. We can derive from such examples a path of action for the individual in an initial stage of crisis. The person is seeking something which seems impossible to find, or of which nothing is known. In such moments, sensible, rational, and well-intentioned advice is completely useless. Such advice could include trying to be less irresponsible, to take a vacation, work less, or to take up a hobby. It is such advice that rarely helps, and is in a completely wrong vein to tackle such a task. Just like the legend of the Holy Grail, the person must enter the forest at the point which seems darkest to him. He must turn towards and directly confront the darkness to find out what its aim is and what it wants from him. In this case, the darkness must be interpreted as an object of the unknown. It's not a moral darkness pushing the night towards evil. It's just something that evokes a fear of the unknown. Within this darkness lies a hidden purpose, so perplexingly unusual and unexpected that meaning can only be derived through dreams welling up from the unconscious. Focusing one's unbiased and undivided attention on the unconscious will reveal one of 2 things. either a flood of meaningful symbolic images or a series of painful realizations of one's conscious attitudes. The latter requires a time to swallow such bitter truths to incorporate and accept the existence of these faults despite the protest of our ego prior to continuing on the journey. The shadow also contains unrealized or unknown attributes and qualities of the ego, traits that could as well be conscious. As an individual attempts to see and understand his shadow, he becomes aware of qualities and impulses he denies in himself but can readily see in others. These qualities can include egotism, laziness, sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots, cowardice, dishonesty, and greed. Such qualities are often papered over by sweet little lies such as, "That doesn't matter, no one will notice it, and everyone does it." Think back to times in your own life when a great bout of emotion has overwhelmed you without warning. This may have occurred when a friend reproaches you about a fault, or someone says something to you which elicits an uncharacteristically angry response. This could also occur in other emotional ranges such as grief or sadness. You may later think, "I don't know what the devil came over me." It is this strong and irrational emotional response that provides a great clue for further introspection. It is underneath this clue that you will likely find a part of your shadow, which you are unaware of, or, if you are aware of it, find so unsettling as to repress to the recesses of your unconscious. It is undoubtedly natural to become angry at criticism. Jesus famously said, "Let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own." But we must take a minute to decide where this anger is coming from. Is it because the criticism is a thinly veiled insult, or a truth too difficult to bear? So what if then, if this criticism arises from your own dreams? This is the exact moment the ego is caught, ensnared within a logical trap. The result is usually an embarrassed silence. It is at this point that the painful and lengthy work of self-education begins. This is a task very much akin to the labors of Hercules. If we may recall, the hero's first task was to clean up, in a single day, the excrement of hundreds of cattle in the Augean stables that had been deposited over decades. The task, by its very description, seems unsurmountable by mortal hands, and very discouraging. This period of self-learning can almost seem like slavery, as though we have submitted ourselves to a higher power. And in this regard, I think that's true. I think everyone needs to undergo a period of intellectual challenge. For me, it was my engineering degree. But for others, it might be different. And it's only once you've experienced this period of slavery to a higher power or to your degree or whatever, can you actually experience freedom. The shadow is not just emissions of consciousness, however. It also manifests in impulsive or inadvertent acts. Before one has time to think, a rampage of emotion erupts from the unconscious, and the evil remark pops forth, or the plot is hatched, or the emotional decision made. The result is often never intended or consciously wanted. This is further complicated in situations of what Jung called collective infection. A single man may be quite rational, but an angry mob can often commit acts quite heinous which no single man or component would ever commit on his own. The collective commitment for primitive acts from the shadow becomes quite compelling in such a scenario. It is particularly in contact with members of the same gender that one's shadow and the shadow of others becomes apparent. In my experience, the sure way to reveal the shadows of others is to go into a circle of friends that already has an established dominance hierarchy and begin to challenge that, either by talking about more interesting things or telling funnier stories. This will quite quickly reveal who has a shadow and what it is. Jung recounts a dream of one of his patients, a hard-working and disciplined professional man of 48 years of age. In achieving such accomplishments as these, he had repressed the pleasure and spontaneity of his youth to a greater extent than suited his nature. The dream goes like this. In the dream, the patient inhabits a large house in town, which he did not yet fully know all the rooms. In the cellar, he discovered several rooms which he had no knowledge of, entering into other cellars and subterranean streets. He felt rather uneasy about these unknown entrances, as they were not locked. Returning to the ground floor, he found a large garden with additional exits on the street or other houses. When he went to investigate, an old childhood friend accosted him, laughing loudly and telling him about his life. He met this friend with some unease, and as he walked a while with them, suddenly 3 beautifully groomed stallions, without riders, rushed past. Jung remarked on the similarity of the house, with all its unknown levels and exits, to that of the unconscious. The Egyptian representation of the underworld also resembles that of the unconscious, with its unknown possibilities. The unknown entrances show how susceptible one is to the influences of one's unconscious dark side, and how uncanny and alien elements can quite easily break in. The old friend represents a part of the man's extroverted and dynamic childhood. Oftentimes, a person's childhood qualities of happiness, irascibility, and trustfulness disappear suddenly, without knowing where they've gone. The old friend probably stands for the dreamer's neglected capacity for enjoying life, and his extroverted side. The groomed horses, likely of military purpose, break loose and dash past as he is conversing with his old childhood friend, showing how his unconscious tendencies to extroversion desire to be freed from the conscious discipline of the mundane life he now leads. Ultimately, the shadow in this dream is typical of an introverted man who retires to seclusion far too often. Whether the shadow becomes our friend or enemy largely depends upon ourselves. The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. The shadow is like that of any other human. Sometimes it needs to be listened to, resisted, or loved, whatever the situation requires. The shadow only becomes hostile when ignored or misunderstood. It can also be said that the function of the shadow is to represent the opposite side of the ego, to hide qualities and tendencies seen in others that the conscious ego resents. The mind would be a simpler place if one could simply integrate the shadow into the conscious personality by attempting to be honest and use one's own insight. But this is not always successful. The power or drive within the shadow cannot always be overcome by reason. In this case, it may be that the conscious self and the unconscious shadow are actually pointing in the same direction, which should be sensibly investigated to see if profit can be reaped. If the shadow contains valuable, vital forces, they should certainly be incorporated into actual experience instead of being repressed. The ego must give up its pride and priggishness to live out something that seems uncertain, worrying, or unknown, but may not be in actuality. This brings to mind the story of Moses in the Quran. In this tale, Moses meets Qadir, an angel of God. They wander along together, but Qadir expresses the fear that Moses will be unable to witness the angel's deeds without indignation. If Moses cannot trust the angel to be just, he has to leave. Qadir then scuttles the boat of some fishermen and kills a handsome young man. Moses blurts out his indignation, and Qadir announces he must leave. But before he does so, explains that the boat was scuttled to save it from pirates, and the young man killed before he went to murder another. Moses realizes that his judgment was too hasty, and Qadir's actions were in fact righteous. From this tale we can learn something. When dark or unknown figures enter our dreams, we cannot simply assume their bad intentions. Whether our dark partner symbolizes a shortcoming we should overcome or a meaningful lesson we should accept, it's a difficult obstacle to overcome on our journey to self-individuation. It is true that dream symbols are often so subtle and complicated that one cannot be sure of their complete meaning. In this case, we should attempt to make a decision and implement it, trusting to our conscious to aid us in the interpretation when our conscious mind falls short. This resembles the situation of Cinderella, when her stepmother throws a pile of peas in front of her and asks her to sort the good from the bad. Putting aside thoughts of hopelessness, Cinderella diligently begins to sort the peas, upon which ants miraculously arrive and help her. These ants represent helpful, deeply unconscious impulses that can only be felt during the implementation of the decision. Essentially, we should not be afraid of making a decision and implementing it when on our journey. In making decisions which may or may not be correct, we should be mindful of any foreseeable consequences and make contingencies. Be cautious in making life-changing decisions on mere unconscious impulse. But what should happen if our unconscious desire should point us towards immorality or unlawfulness? In this case, we should consider if the discomfort of resisting our unconscious outweighs the possible consequences of such actions. This is a great example where the spiritual guide comes in handy. It's highly unlikely that Jesus, the spiritual guide of Christians, would present such a seemingly immoral choice to a believer. Oftentimes, such unconscious desires towards evil are a false end, or a negative manifestation of a greater unfulfilled need. In this case, great effort should be made to find alternative routes to individuation. As an old Buddhist master once said, we must follow the example of the ox herder who watches his oxen with a stick so that they will not graze upon others' meadows. So, it's now time to wrap this up. In the shadow lies the key to your personal development and realization of your destiny. The path is anything but simple or straightforward and requires a great deal of self-learning to go with it. Freedom can only be realized by first undergoing a period of slavery to a higher purpose. You will know when you're on the right path because everything in your life will begin to come into focus and your satisfaction will increase. You may find yourself less reliant on your traditional coping mechanisms such as escapism through movies, alcohol, and sexual release. Your friends will notice a change in your personality, and you may even need to introduce yourself to new social circles. Whatever happens, I encourage you to stay on the path, because it is narrow, but this way lies great treasure. Good luck.